Hello! Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Merle Massey. I'm the coordinator of undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. We're really excited today. Our guest today is Michael Robin, and he is actually at the Western Producer, but his background behind his, writing for the farming audience is science communication. And his presentation today is about science communication for a skeptical world. And for those of us who just went through Easter and maybe had one of those odd uncles that doesn't believe in COVID and thinks that this is just a flu. Perhaps Michael will be able to give us a few pro tips and tricks that we can use when we're having these communications with people who are skeptical about science in general. And
Mhm.
with that, Michael, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thanks, Merle. Thanks for the invitation, and also thanks for everyone for attending today. Because I understand that you've got final assignments, final exams, and everybody's running off their feet. So, thanks for making carving out a little bit of time out of that busy schedule to accommodate this. Really appreciate you coming. As Merle mentioned, I'm currently a journalist at the Western Producer. My official title is Farm Management Editor. I've been a science writer and communicator for more than 30 years. And a lot of that science writing and communication does relate to agriculture. So toxicology, you're talking about pesticides, herbicides, that sort of thing. If you're talking about genetics, genomics, that's talking about plant breeding, livestock breeding. Turned out that a lot of the science writing that I've been doing over the years had an agricultural component to it. There's an awful lot of science that goes into agriculture, including artificial intelligence and drones, and there's all sorts of cool stuff happening. So anyway, I want to talk to you today about unbelievable, I've called this. It's one of the things that kind of uh, had me thinking over the years is why do people believe such strange things sometimes in the wake of all evidence to the contrary. So let's get started. Do you believe, brothers and sisters, you heard that before. It's the cliche with the evangelical preacher. But I just hang on for a second here. I've got a little technical difficulty. Uh-oh. Oh, let's try this right from the top. There's always some sort of a technical glitch. I apologize for that. So anyway, I believe in chlorine and fluoride in water, vaccines. Just got my COVID-19 today, as I mentioned. I believe nuclear power is a good thing. Not only that, it might be essential if we're going to meet the challenges of climate change. And yes, climate change is a thing, and we're causing it. I believe things like GMOs are essential to help farmers around the world feed themselves, their families, and a growing global population. I believe pesticides such as glyphosate are right up there in terms of importance in feeding ourselves and protecting the environment too. I believe in the theory of evolution, and that's essential to our understanding of life on Earth, including things like human behavior and societies. But why do I call these beliefs? Well, I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm not a toxicologist. I'm a journalist, a science writer. At some point, I have to take it on faith that the established science on these things is true. So maybe my core belief is in science. But like everyone, I'm not immune to unreason. I can still knock on wood when I'm feeling uneasy about breaking a mirror or walking by a black cat. It's irrational, but it's there. So belief is a powerful thing. It can be good or bad. I posit that when our beliefs are not based on facts, bad things can happen. And there's the saying that you may have heard before: it ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. I haven't been able to find out the who said this, but it's been often attributed to Mark Twain. So, what is the power of belief? Belief can be stronger than facts, and we saw this in January in the United States. Millions of Americans still fervently believe their national election was rigged and Donald Trump is still their president. They believed it so strongly, they literally stormed their own capital, first time in their history. Why? Because Trump told them it was true over and over and over again. This is a phenomenon known among psychologists as the illusion of truth, and we're all susceptible to it. And once we believe something, it's very, very hard to change our minds. The community of science, lest we become a little bit too smug about this, is not immune to this. We stubbornly hold on to cherished beliefs. The people that came up with the idea of plate tectonics, for example, and antiseptics were ridiculed in their day. It wasn't until after their deaths that their ideas were widely accepted. In fact, this feeds into something that the great physicist Max Planck once observed. He said that basically new ideas don't come into vogue on their own merits, but rather because their champions eventually die, and that makes room for new ideas. And that's very familiar in the context of religion, where people, would rather die than give up their beliefs. But why do we believe? It seems like a dangerous thing, but boy, is it ever efficient. We make snap decisions on inadequate information or even information designed to manipulate us. We go with our gut. These initial decisions form the first building blocks of our belief, though. You say that makes sense, and then you start looking for other things that looked like the same. With these initial blocks in place, you look for other ones. It's called confirmation bias. And rarely do we look for ideas and information that weaken the wall or remove it altogether. In fact, we actively resist that. There's a researcher, a psychologist from York University here in Canada, James Alcock, and he calls this the belief engine. I'd highly recommend his book, Belief, to anyone that wants a deep dive into the subject. I believe it came out in 2017. But belief is an essential part of our thought process. Think about it. If we had to justify every single thing we do with evidence, we would get nothing done. It's much easier to say, Greenpeace says GMOs are bad. Sounds legit. Greenpeace are the good guys, and GMOs sound scary, so I'll shop from the organic aisle. Great, got that done. Now I've got to get the kids to soccer practice. It's efficient. People, no, believing doesn't make things real, though. People believe in a lot of things, and they get right pissed off when you confront their beliefs. I have people in my extended family who believe that COVID-19 is a hoax, vaccines are poison. They believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory, for the love of God. And of course, the cult of Trump. They believe these things passionately, despite no credible evidence to support them. And of course, they would tell you that you are the one that are deluded and you must do your research to find the truth. A few other bits of information you may have seen, they're common on my social media feeds. Human-caused climate change is a hoax. Glyphosate it causes cancer and kills insects. Never mind that it's a herbicide and doesn't act on insects. I know a person personally, again in my extended family, who refused to put a microwave in their new house because microwaves cause cancer. Now, keep in mind that she's fine with cell phones, and cell phones are basically microwave transceivers that you hold right beside your brain. So, not rational. Speaking of cell phones, I did a quick Google search a few weeks ago and of just 5G causes, and I got some interesting suggestions. It causes cancer, tinnitus, hair loss, global warming, and hemorrhoids. So to me, that's a kind of a high price to pay for better, faster Netflix performance.
I'm busy laughing over here.
It's awesome. So we can't trust our gut. Uh, there is way too much information to process, and we still have to get the kids to soccer practice, as we said before. So what do we do? Well, we ask our friends, but this can just create a bigger bubble of belief. It's really hard to listen to someone who holds beliefs that are very different from your own, so you're less likely to consult or listen to them. We also consult sources we trust, but we're prone to choosing ones that we agree with. I try to pick from the middle. I'd count the AAAS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Excuse me. Snopes, of course, they're kind of the original fact-checking organization. Cochrane Library, Genetic Literacy Project, Environment Canada, for climate change stuff, Mayo Clinic for medical stuff. Those are the ones that I trust. There's good sources out there. Other people put their trust in sources I don't really consider credible. I'd count Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, CBAN, all very much agenda driven. Our own Interchurch Uranium Committee in Saskatchewan, again, agenda driven. And of course, there's Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop. So, how do you get through to people who don't agree with you? Don't ever say dumb it down. Well, you can if you want. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but to me, it really gets under my skin when people are doing science communication and they say dumb it down. What a condescending thing to say. Like here's the guy that's going to dumb it down for you. Don't you want to give him a slap? You know, dumbing it down implies the person that you're talking to isn't smart enough to understand what you're saying. I don't know about you, but that puts me on the defensive immediately, and it's not a good starting point for a productive conversation. It also puts the wrong picture in our heads about audiences. It clouds our thinking and impairs our ability to communicate effectively. Dumbing it down implies that we're talking to fools. Our audiences are not stupid. In fact, there's something called the Flynn effect that shows at least some populations are getting smarter, although I think this may be leveling out and changing. But these smart people can do some pretty dumb things. Now, why is that? Well, you can be smart, but you may not be rational. And I'd argue that the smart dumb paradigm is a little bit too limiting and it limits our thinking. So think about it as being rational. There's a psychologist, American psychologist Barbara Drescher. She writes that rationality has four parts to it. And one is the intelligence. So, okay, yes, you have to be smart. You do need to have that, processing power, the being smart. You do need to have knowledge. So that means reliable information, which today can be quite a big challenge. There's a need for cognition. That means that you actually have to care enough and make the effort to think about it and figure things out. And finally, this one might be the more important one, keeping an open mind and being able to admit you're wrong. Humility, I guess, is another one. Drescher gives a little bit saltier version of this one. She says, we can be irrational because we are stupid, ignorant, lazy, arrogant, or some combination of those.
Mike, what does GIGO stand for?
Oh,
GIGO.
Gigo, I'm sorry. That is, oh, sorry. I'm throwing. That comes from programming, computer programming, and it means garbage in, garbage out. So when I'm talking about knowledge that you want to put in, that has to be reliable information. If you have unreliable information, you'll get unreliable conclusions. Actual facts rather than, fake facts or facts from a source that has an agenda or the lunatic fringe is. Uh, I think it's easier to guard against the lunatic fringe than it is against things that are a little bit wrong, because that can kind of pull you down the path. There's a couple of, I won't mention the site because I don't want to drive traffic to it, but a friend of mine said, what do you think of this article? And I read the article and I thought, it seems almost okay. Um, but there's something that doesn't quite click with me. And then I figured out what it was. There was one little thing about climate change. I thought, okay. So I went to the site itself and then I did some of my use some of my tools. There's a site called Media Bias Fact Check, and I checked this particular site, and well, they were way off in La La Land on the far, far right. And so I got back to my friend and I said, "Yeah, I wouldn't trust anything on this site." One of the techniques some of these sites use is they tell you a story that's almost true. That goes into a whole other conversation about the long con, about the confidence game. You tell somebody something mostly true except for a little thing, and then you keep on adding more and more untruth until they don't even realize how deep down the rabbit hole you've lured them. But yeah, that's the confidence game. That's another discussion. Sorry. Anyway, that's a long ways from Gigo.
Thanks, Mike. No, we appreciate it.
All right, so let's carry on here. So, yes, I love this guy. Stay skeptical, my friends. Yes, people really are manipulating information to influence our behavior. There's money in misinformation, whether it's advertising, misinformation, propaganda. People are working hard to get you to change your behavior or cut them a check. Some of this is pretty benign. For example, in election campaigns, we expect competing promises and platforms, but we also expect the spin as they try to get our votes. But we're not being paranoid when we see more subtle and sinister players out there. There really are people out there that work to manipulate our elections. Hello, Mr. Trump. Or attitudes towards renewable energy and natural gas, or whether we should avoid eat GMOs or eat organic, all of these things. People have agendas. As James Alcock puts it, I quote, "This creates a challenge for us all to be flexible enough to modify our beliefs appropriately when new, incredible information is presented, while at the same time be steadfast enough to preserve them from manipulation by others." So what are beliefs based upon? Well, sometimes not much. There's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's named after the researchers who first described it in a paper in 1999. Its basic tenet is that you don't know enough to know that you don't know. And it gets worse. Those who know the least think they know the most, whether it's vaccines, climate science, GMOs, etc. It's uncomfortable not to know. Belief shields us from this uncomfortable uncertainty. When was the last time you changed your mind on something you really believed in? It's a really unpleasant experience. It's something called cognitive dissonance. That's the stress you feel when you're confronted with evidence that conflicts with your beliefs. It lights up actually the same parts of the brain as physical pain. It actually hurts you. So realize, have some compassion for your audience. This is what you're asking them to do. It's painful to let go of a cherished belief, and eating crow is hard enough without having to swallow a side order of sarcasm and ridicule. So have compassion, patience, and be nice. Oh, what happened to my? Oh, okay. Catherine went away. I have a picture on here. Anyway, it's important to know that just because somebody rejects one bit of science, it doesn't mean they reject it all. Rather, it's usually tend to accept or reject science based on their core beliefs. This is why you can have people accept the safety of GMOs and reject the idea of human-caused climate change, or vice versa. Canadian atmospheric scientist Catherine Hayhoe puts it this way: people don't reject science wholesale because they have a problem with the science. Rather, they reject it because it conflicts with their worldview, their ideology, and ultimately their identity. So, as science communicators, where do we go from here? Well, the "you're an idiot" strategy is not a very effective one. Yet there are plentiful examples on science sites, and I'm sure you've visited some of them too. They point out examples of the absurd, they make fun of them. If you're trying to reach people outside your bubble, you're probably wasting your time at these sites. People will double down, they'll stop listening, um, and they'll actually harden their positions. That's something that they call the backfire effect. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. The thinking fast part I mentioned with the belief engine. The thinking slow part is taking your time, engaging in logical thinking, in other words, being rational. Our goal is to get people to question their positions, to get them to stop and think. You can't change somebody's mind, they have to change it for themselves. So we're right. How do we get people to think? Surely you can just tell them the truth and they'll come around. There's a name for that approach, the information deficit model. But when you're up against belief, this often doesn't work very well. You may be right, but so what? Who cares? Do facts matter? Lest we despair, it turns out that knowledge does have a power to change beliefs, but don't expect to be a silver bullet. You do have to present that knowledge correctly, and you shouldn't expect miracles. John McPheeters, he's a University of Regina social psychologist. He did a study on GMO attitudes a couple of years ago. He found people will change their attitudes if you present them with information on GMOs that is neutral and easy to understand. But he found that such materials are pretty hard to come by when they went, looking for it on the interwebs. He also observed they had to start at a very much more basic level than they had assumed. The researchers had to explain what DNA and how it works, for example. People told McPheeters, and I quote, "I've had people say they try not to eat things that contain DNA because they're afraid it's going to contaminate their genes." So don't assume you know what your audience knows. So the lessons learned here, aim for neutrality, simplicity. Don't assume that you know what your audience knows before you start planning your communications. Find out what makes them comfortable and what makes them afraid. Do your research. So the information deficit model, does it work after all? Well, to a point. McPeters found that people became more willing to accept GMOs after getting the information, but not totally willing. For example, 46% of the control group were willing to eat GMOs. McPheeters' information strategy bumped this up to 68%. So that's a pretty significant bump, but it's not a silver bullet. So who are we talking to? There's a saying in public discourse that 20% of the people will hate what you're saying, 20% will love you, 60% are in the movable middle. The most vociferous voices of opposition are unlikely to change their minds, nor are your most ardent supporters. But that movable middle, if they're paying attention at all, they're sitting on the fence. Our job as communicators, when they're ready to get off that fence, is to get them to get off on the side of the true and not on the side of the woo. So how do we do that? Well, there's a few ways to do it. Here's one. Uh, this technique is called talking for the third ear. Basically, it means talking as if we don't know anyone is listening, but we do, and they are. We do this with kids all the time. Like if you want to praise up your kid's not going to believe you because and dad are supposed to say nice things about their kids. So when you're talking to one of the other parents and your kid is within earshot, they're listening to you, and they become more willing to accept the information as being unbiased. And it also takes the focus away from the audience. People will listen to opposing views if they're not directed at them. It's non-threatening. It's a topic that interests them, and they'll compare it to their own views, if for no other reason to try and shoot it down later. Practice active listening. I know it's hard to do this sometimes because in some conversations it's so absurd that you have to bite your down on your tongue hard. But please try it. And also, don't be that guy that just looks like he's listening, but is actually just waiting for you to finish so he can talk. Listen attentively, process what they're thinking, and then ask strategic questions. Ask for clarification. Well, if that's true, then why? Your objective is to show them that you're taking their position seriously, but you see some inconsistencies that you find puzzling. Your goal is not to change their positions, but to get them to doubt it, and in doubting it, engage their logical decision-making process, that thinking slow. So, misinformation, both incidental and deliberate, has been a bugbear of science communications for a long, long time, for as long as I've been in science communications, for 30 plus years. It kind of bubbled up to the surface, even when outrageous events like Wakefield's vaccine autism paper and Sarolina's GMO cancer rat paper and subsequent blatant media manipulation. And it took a long time. These things are still, the echoes are still resonating in the world. In 2016, a lot more people started to take notice, of course, of the events of the presidential election down there. It became rampant. Blatant lies, conspiracy theories, they're passed off as truth, and people were believing that it's true. What the heck is going on? So it actually became a hot area of scientific research. Scientists are now doing what they always do. They research the heck out of this. I should hasten to add, they've been doing this before, but it's just gone into overdrive now. The bottom line for communicators and people who are trying to work in this area, or even somebody that's trying to have some answers for that annoying uncle at Thanksgiving, we do have some research back tactics to draw on. I'm going to share a few here. These ones here are 10 ways to combat misinformation. This comes from Terry Flynn and Tim Lee at McMaster University. This is published through the Institute for Public Relations. And there's a few things here. I don't need to read them all, but basically concise explanations, explain using alternate accounts. So knock out the falsehood, backfill the gap with solid information, that sort of thing. Repeat the correction. Just like you say something false and it builds belief, a correction repeated and repeated and repeated also builds belief. The more familiar the information is, the more likely it is to be taken as true. Don't repeat the misinformation without the right context, otherwise you're just amplifying that message. Concentrate on why it's wrong and correct immediately. The longer the falsehood is out there, the stronger it gets. I had a example that I trot out. I was working for an organization that had a big event happen, and it took them 3 days to issue their first tweet. The journalists that were covering it had their first tweet out, I think, in 3 minutes. So, it was just useless. In the information age, that means that you need someone monitoring your feeds, and they have to have the authority, the agency to respond immediately. Visuals. We talked about how Well, here's a good example right here. This is Seralini, the infamous Seralini with his GMO rat study. This particular rat is a Sprague Dawley rat, and if you raise Sprague Dawley rats, they will get tumors. That's what they're designed to do. But look at that poor critter. Normally, they're euthanized long before those tumors get to that size, but they were allowed to do this because it's a horrific picture, and he got a whole lot of publicity out of this. The media, and of which I'm now a member, the media really fell down on this one. They basically did not call him on all of this. Bottom line, visuals, images evoke emotion. The purveyors of misinformation know this. You can actually use it too for good purposes. Numbers that are very powerful, but you can take thick, meaningful statistics and put them into graphs, present them as pictures, visual form, and people will say, "Oh yeah, that I can see that one is bigger than the other one by a considerable amount." What we're going for is to get past that. Uh, we can actually get past the words and go direct to the part of your mind that handles pictures, which I understand about, or I've read that about 80% of the information that we get is visual. So, inoculating against misinformation, that means getting the good stuff out there early and often. I talked about those first bricks of belief. Try to make your bricks the first ones. Choose your public face wisely. Experts are good, but it depends on how they come across. You have someone that's very stiff and nervous in front of the crowds. Maybe that's not the first one that you want to put out there. Ask when you're talking to this person, if I didn't know this person, would I like them and trust them? So it depends on who's doing the talking for you. Encourage and support analytical thinking. Ask people, what is misinformation? Why is it out there? Who cares? Like, what's the harm? What can I, as a parent, brother, friend, do about it? And also talking about the audience's sense of self, like you talk about the Haywood comment earlier. People don't disagree with science in general; they disagree with things that really threaten their sense of self. Present a worldview that's consistent with their moral foundation, that is core to their identity and sense of self-worth, or they will stop listening to you. So, this guy here, if you have not yet heard of Tim Caulfield, I would strongly encourage you to see what he's up to, because he's kind of at the forefront of this. He's a researcher and academic from the University of Alberta. He's looked at this issue of misinformation extensively. The good news is debunking actually works if you do it right. He's got these tips too. Use science, clear and shareable content. Make sure when you share content that you don't share the content and amplify the other message, like put some sort of a scribble on it, some circle on it, so people can see that, no, this is not what you believe. Use trustworthy independent sources. Note the scientific consensus when there is one, and that science evolves. So if there's a scientific consensus on climate change, say why, GMOs, et cetera, et cetera. And also be nice. If you go to if you look up Tim Caulfield on YouTube, he did one recently. I think mean tweets or mean comments on his site, and he does that. And he's just a really likable guy. You'd think, yeah, I'd like to sit down and have a beer with this guy. He's really cool. Consider a narrative. Can you turn this into a story? We as humans codify our knowledge as stories. So if we can spin this into a story, that's a good way to have it stick. Highlight the gaps in logic and the rhetorical tricks. So if you spot, BS, you can say, well, if that is true, then the sky would have to be green. Don't you agree? Or something like that, right? Like point out those flaws. Lead with the facts, not the information. That's pretty straightforward. And again, we're talking to the movable middle, not the hardcore denier, not the hardcore believer. Tim actually has I don't know if it's still on Netflix, but he has a series called A User's Guide to Cheating Death. And it has to do with a lot of health fads and fashions, and how most of them are based on nothing. So again, you can't change somebody else's mind. There's an old joke that goes like that. How many psychologists does it take to change the light bulb? The answer is just one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. There's a few ideas from James Alcock on how to fan that desire in your audience. Plant a seed of doubt, like, for example, using that third ear method, asking sincere questions, that sort of thing. Find a wedge issue. For example, if you come up with, say, capital punishment, well, what if an innocent guy gets killed? Like, use a specific example if you can, so people really can put themselves in there in that headspace. Uh, Counter explanations. Have them to play the devil's advocate, like, and you get them to do this. Why do you think liberals think this? Why do you think conservatives think this? And just ask them, why would they do that? They seem like nice folks. Why would they believe that? Don't focus on the false either. Rather than push against the anti-vax stance, for example, stress the dangers of communicable disease, such as old folks and young babies dying of flu, babies with whooping cough, personal experiences. I've got, among my elderly relatives, there's still a couple of three polio survivors out there. One of my cousins was permanently crippled by polio. And also allow them to save face. Again, that gets back to that original point that I was saying. You're an idiot is not a good thing to say to somebody. Allow them to save face. So, for example, you can say, I can understand why you'd believe that. I mean, considering, from what you know, anybody would believe that. People don't like to believe they're wrong or that they're backing down from their beliefs. You're just saying, okay, yeah, of course, if I was in your shoes, I'd believe the same thing. But here's some new stuff. What do you think? This is something that came out last fall. This is Paul Rudd, and if you know the American actor. Um, when you're looking at, you have to look at your packaging, platform, personality. So who's telling the message? How is it packaged up? That sort of thing. Here's a COVID-19 example. Canadian youth and youth in general haven't been great, or they weren't great at masking up to help control the pandemic. Robert Soroka, he's a professor of marketing at Concordia University, says this boils down to three problems. Our health messages are going out to traditional media, which millennials don't use. Our health message is used painfully contrived, fear-based language like, you're going to die. Millennials don't believe you. Health messengers are stuffy, middle-aged authority figures like, love you, Dr. Tan, but my gosh, you're not cool. This guy is an American actor, of course, Paul Rudd. This video is called Certified Young Person Paul Rudd Wants You to Wear a Mask. Heads up, Paul is not that young. That's part of the gag. But it's the right medium, it's the right language, it's the right messenger. It was released on September 14th of 2020, and within 2 weeks, it had 1.4 million views. Of course, the real measure is to see whether millennials are actually wearing more masks, but Paul got their attention at least, and that's the first step. There's a lot of information and misinformation and disinformation out there, but there's also a lot of folks out there fighting the good fight against it and using some innovative ways to do it. For many issues, the same questions come up again and again. So I recommend that you keep a file of credible sources where you can get the answers to respond quickly. Again, like I mentioned before, you have to respond quick in this day and age. Keep this up to date by pushing French references in your resource file as they come through your feeds. So how do you know what's the good stuff? Well, as a general rule, I try to avoid any outlets that are trying to sell me something. However, I also use and refer to some very good corporate-backed sites that offer excellent information. GMO Answers is actually a good one, for example. Corporations, after all, conduct much research. Some figures I've heard it's up to half of all research done is done by corporations. They have also a lot of money for great communications campaigns. That does not detract from that pesky profit motive, though, and that makes them automatically suspect. So check what they say against neutral sources such as government and university research. So how do you know what information is good and what isn't? A little bit continuation here. There's a book you should read if you haven't. It's actually it came out in 1995. It's called The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. Written in 1995, but still very, very relevant today, written by the late, great Carl Sagan, possibly one of the best science communicators ever. He has some tips on how to deal with baloney or BS. Google baloney detection kit, and you'll get the 20 essential tools to keep you from stepping in the BS. In true skeptic style, and you would expect this from Sagan, says like all tools, the baloney detection kit can be misused, applied out of context, or even employed as a rote alternative to thinking. Again, thinking. But if you apply it judiciously, it can make all the difference in the world, not the least in which evaluating our own arguments before we present them to others. There's a thing about how it's easy to be fooled, and the easiest person to fool is yourself. So you do have to, again, remain humble. So another thing to do, I was talking about going into your networks. Develop your contacts locally, on campus, in the province, nationally and internationally. I'm going to do a shameless plug here because I'm on the board of the Science Writers and Communicators of Canada. I've been a member of some years and I'm a board member now. And hey, students, member fees are very reasonable. $100 if you're not a student, $35 if you are. So if you're about to graduate, here's a chance to get on at the student rate. One of the things that I've found over the years is I get access to a Canada-wide network of really informed and passionate science folk. If you want to go ag specific, I would say the Canadian Farm Writers Federation or the Saskatchewan Farm Writers are good choices. Develop those international contacts. I've got some. Conferences are out for now, but the cool thing about this is that those international conferences are now pulling in a whole bunch more people via Zoom or WebEx or whatever they happen to be using. So it's quite easy to contact scientists from all over the world. Quite a few of them are active on Twitter. They'll respond to queries with answers and references, for example. As I've said, everybody's needs is going to be a little bit different depending on what you're working on and where your interests lie. So your resources will end up being specific to your needs. One caveat, when you're putting together these things, don't create a filter bubble around yourself filled only with people that agree with you. So, talked about local, everything starts local. Develop that local network of science communicators. So it'll be your colleagues among your class. It'll be your profs. It'll be researchers that you rub elbows with, that sort of thing. No shortage of topic areas, but the strategies will often be interchangeable. So certainly seek out your colleagues in your field. But if you're working in energy and you know a person struggling with the issue of vaccine hesitancy, take them for a coffee, buy them some lunch, Zoom them if you can't meet face to face yet. A lot of these things are interchangeable, a lot of these strategies. Identify people that are on the front lines of science communication in your community. You can join them. Cafe Sci Saskatoon is one of these. Julie Boner here at the University of Saskatchewan is a champion of this, and she's an excellent contact. You can find them on their Facebook page. They've been doing virtual events during the COVID pandemic, so you can they're still active. So they're also an excellent resource. So with that, this is me. Thank you for your attention. I had intended on knocking this off at 30, but I went a little bit over. Hopefully I've allowed a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was fantastic. I'm going to stop the recording and then we can open it up for questions and discussion. Thanks again.
You're very welcome.